In 1550 BC, something extraordinary happened along the banks of the Nile River, something that would reshape the entire ancient world and create the most powerful military machine humanity had ever witnessed. The Hyksos rulers, those foreign invaders who had humiliated Egypt for over a century, were finally expelled from the sacred land of the Pharaohs. But this was not merely a restoration of the old order. This was the birth of something entirely new, something terrifying, something magnificent. The pharaohs who emerged from this victory were not the same rulers who had lost their kingdom to foreign invaders. They were transformed, hardened, hungry for conquest. They had tasted the bitter poison of foreign domination, and they swore by every god in the Egyptian pantheon that they would never taste it again. Their solution was simple yet revolutionary. They would become so powerful, so overwhelmingly dominant, that no foreign power would ever dare challenge Egyptian supremacy again. The 18th dynasty pharaohs emerged from the ashes of humiliation with a singular obsession: military superiority so absolute that it would make Egypt invincible. They studied the weapons and tactics of their former oppressors. They adopted the horse-drawn chariot, that terrifying instrument of war that had given the Hyksos their devastating advantage. But they did not merely copy their enemies. They improved upon everything they learned. Egyptian engineers developed lighter, faster chariots with wider axles that provided greater stability during high-speed maneuvers. Egyptian craftsmen forged bronze weapons of unprecedented quality, their edges sharper and more durable than anything their enemies possessed. Egyptian generals developed tactical doctrines that combined chariot charges with disciplined infantry formations and devastating archery barrages that could annihilate enemy armies before they even reached Egyptian lines. Thutmose III ascended to the throne around 1479 BC, and with his coronation began the most systematic program of military conquest the ancient world had ever witnessed. This was not a pharaoh content to defend Egypt's borders. This was a conqueror who dreamed of an empire stretching from the cataracts of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates River. Over the course of his 54-year reign, Thutmose III would conduct 17 recorded military campaigns, each one expanding Egyptian territory and influence further than any of his predecessors had imagined possible. His armies marched through the scorching deserts of Sinai, crossed the fertile plains of Canaan, and penetrated deep into the heartland of Syria. They captured cities that had never seen Egyptian soldiers, extracted tribute from kingdoms that had never acknowledged Egyptian authority, and established a network of vassal states that transformed Egypt from a regional power into a true empire. The Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BC stands as the defining moment of Thutmose III's military career and one of the most brilliantly executed campaigns in ancient military history. The strategic situation facing the Egyptian pharaoh was daunting. A coalition of Canaanite city-states led by the ruler of Kadesh had assembled a formidable army in the strategically vital Jezreel Valley, blocking the main trade route between Egypt and Mesopotamia. The coalition forces numbered approximately 15,000 warriors, including experienced chariot units and well-equipped infantry formations that had been preparing for Egyptian attack for months. They had positioned themselves behind the fortified walls of Megiddo, confident that the city's defenses and their numerical strength would be sufficient to repel any Egyptian assault. Thutmose III faced a critical decision that would determine the fate of his entire campaign. 3 routes led from the Egyptian staging area to the plain before Megiddo. 2 of these routes were relatively safe, offering wide roads that would allow the Egyptian army to maintain formation and arrive at the battlefield in good order. The 3rd route, the narrow Aruna Pass, was considered suicidal by every military expert in the Egyptian command structure. The pass was so narrow that the army would have to march in single file, stretching the Egyptian forces over several kilometers and making them vulnerable to ambush at any point along the route. If the enemy had positioned even a small force at the pass's exit, they could slaughter the Egyptians as they emerged one by one onto the plain. The pharaoh's generals pleaded with him to take one of the safer routes. They presented detailed arguments about the tactical disadvantages of the Aruna Pass, the risks of ambush, the impossibility of deploying their forces effectively if they encountered resistance at the pass's exit. Thutmose III listened to their counsel with the patience expected of a divine ruler, then rejected it completely. He understood something his generals did not. The enemy expected him to take the safe route. They had positioned their forces to intercept an Egyptian army approaching from the north or south. They had not adequately defended the Aruna Pass because they could not imagine any competent commander choosing such a dangerous approach. The pharaoh's genius lay in recognizing that the most dangerous route was also the most unexpected, and that surprise could transform apparent weakness into decisive advantage. The Egyptian army began its march through the Aruna Pass before dawn, with Thutmose III personally leading the advance guard. The pharaoh's golden chariot gleamed in the early morning light as he guided his forces through the narrow defile, his blue war crown marking him as the divine representative of Amun-Ra on earth. The march took the entire day, with the Egyptian columns stretching for kilometers through the treacherous terrain. Every soldier understood the risk they were taking. Every officer knew that a single enemy ambush could destroy the entire expedition, but they followed their pharaoh without hesitation, trusting in his divine judgment and military genius. The gamble paid off spectacularly. When the Egyptian vanguard emerged onto the plain before Megiddo, they found the enemy completely unprepared for their arrival. The coalition forces had concentrated their strength along the northern and southern approaches, leaving only minimal screening forces to watch the Aruna Pass that they considered impassable for a major army. The sudden appearance of Egyptian chariots on the plain threw the enemy command into chaos. Messengers raced to recall forces from their prepared positions, while coalition commanders struggled to reorganize their defensive arrangements to meet this unexpected threat. Thutmose III did not give them time to recover. As soon as sufficient Egyptian forces had emerged from the pass and deployed into battle formation, the pharaoh ordered an immediate attack. The Egyptian chariot corps, numbering over 1,000 vehicles, swept across the plain in a thundering wave of bronze and leather. The pharaoh himself led the charge, his powerful composite bow sending arrow after arrow into the enemy ranks as his chariot driver guided their vehicle through the chaos of battle. The coalition forces, caught out of position and psychologically shattered by the unexpected Egyptian approach, broke almost immediately. Thousands of enemy soldiers fled toward the walls of Megiddo, abandoning their weapons, their chariots, and their wounded comrades in their desperate flight to safety. The Egyptian victory at Megiddo was overwhelming, but it was not complete. In their eagerness to plunder the abandoned enemy camp, Egyptian soldiers allowed the fleeing coalition forces to reach the safety of Megiddo's walls. The city's defenders, recognizing that their gates could not accommodate the mass of refugees, lowered ropes and clothing from the walls to haul their defeated allies to safety. This momentary lapse in Egyptian discipline transformed what could have been a war-ending victory into the beginning of a 7-month siege. Thutmose III was reportedly furious at his soldiers' lack of discipline, declaring that the capture of Megiddo would have been worth the capture of 1,000 cities, given its strategic importance and the concentration of enemy leadership within its walls. The siege of Megiddo demonstrated Egyptian engineering capabilities and logistical sophistication that matched their tactical brilliance on the battlefield. Egyptian engineers constructed a massive wooden palisade around the entire city, cutting off all possibility of resupply or reinforcement. The circumvallation stretched for several kilometers, incorporating watchtowers, defensive positions, and supply depots that enabled the besieging forces to maintain their positions indefinitely. Egyptian supply trains, operating with the precision that characterized all aspects of pharaonic administration, delivered food, water, weapons, and replacement equipment to the siege lines with clockwork regularity. The defenders of Megiddo, watching their supplies dwindle, while Egyptian forces grew stronger with each passing week, understood that their situation was hopeless. After 7 months of siege, Megiddo surrendered unconditionally. The Egyptian scribes who accompanied the campaign recorded the spoils with characteristic precision. 924 chariots captured, including the gold-decorated vehicle of the king of Kadesh himself, 2,041 horses, representing the finest breeding stock in the Levant, 200 suits of armor, including bronze-scale armor of Mesopotamian design that Egyptian craftsmen would study and improve upon, 502 bows, demonstrating the scale of the coalition's archery capabilities, 1,929 cattle, 2,000 goats, and 20,500 sheep, representing the agricultural wealth of the defeated territories, and countless weapons, tools, and luxury goods that filled Egyptian storehouses for years afterward. The victory at Megiddo established Egyptian dominance over the Levant for the next century, and demonstrated the military capabilities that would make Egypt the supreme power in the ancient Near East. But Thutmose III was not satisfied with a single campaign, however successful. Over the following decades, he would conduct 16 additional military expeditions, each one extending Egyptian influence further into foreign territories. His armies crossed the Euphrates River, penetrating into the heartland of the Mitanni kingdom that had long challenged Egyptian interests in Syria. They pushed south into Nubia, extending Egyptian control beyond the fourth cataract of the Nile, and securing access to the gold mines that would fund Egyptian imperial ambitions for generations. They established garrison posts along the Mediterranean coast, creating a network of fortified positions that enabled rapid deployment of Egyptian forces to any threatened sector of the empire. The conquest of Nubia proceeded simultaneously with the northern campaigns, driven by Egypt's insatiable demand for gold and exotic materials that could not be obtained within the traditional boundaries of the kingdom. Egyptian forces pushed beyond the first cataract at Aswan, the traditional southern boundary of Egypt, proper, establishing fortified settlements that combined military garrisons with administrative centers capable of governing the conquered territories. The fortress at Buhen, constructed during the Middle Kingdom and expanded dramatically under Thutmose III, exemplified the scale and sophistication of Egyptian military engineering. The fortress covered over 13,000 square meters, its massive mud brick walls rising 11 meters high and 5 meters thick. Elaborate gate systems featuring multiple defensive barriers and killing zones made direct assault virtually impossible, while defensive towers positioned at regular intervals provided overlapping fields of fire that could devastate any attacking force. The Nubian fortresses were not merely military installations, but complete administrative centers capable of governing vast territories and managing the extraction of resources that sustained Egyptian imperial power. Each fortress contained granaries capable of storing years of food supplies, workshops for producing and repairing weapons and equipment, barracks for housing permanent garrison forces, and administrative offices, where Egyptian scribes recorded every aspect of provincial governance with the meticulous precision that characterized pharaonic bureaucracy. The fortress commanders held authority equivalent to provincial governors in Egypt, proper responsible for maintaining order, collecting tribute and ensuring the steady flow of gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals that Egyptian markets demanded. The gold mines of Nubia operated on an industrial scale that would not be matched anywhere in the world for another 2 millennia. Thousands of workers, including war captives, convicted criminals, and conscripted laborers, toiled in the desert heat to extract ore from deposits that seemed inexhaustible to ancient observers. Egyptian engineers developed sophisticated techniques for locating gold-bearing rock, sinking shafts to reach underground deposits, and processing ore to extract maximum quantities of precious metal. The Turin Papyrus, dating to the reign of Ramesses IV, preserves a detailed geological map of the Nubian mining regions, showing topographical features, well locations, processing facilities, and the routes connecting mining sites with transportation hubs on the Nile. This document represents the oldest known geological map in human history and demonstrates the systematic approach that characterized Egyptian resource extraction throughout the imperial period. The gold production from Nubian mines reached approximately 1,000 kilograms annually during peak periods, providing the pharaohs with unprecedented wealth that funded military campaigns, monumental construction projects, and the diplomatic gift exchanges that maintained Egypt's international relationships. Foreign rulers throughout the ancient Near East coveted Egyptian gold, sending envoys to request supplies of the precious metal and offering their most valuable products in exchange. The Amarna letters, discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, preserve correspondence from the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and other major powers, all requesting Egyptian gold with varying degrees of diplomatic subtlety. The Babylonian king Bernaburiash II complained that the gold Egypt had sent him was insufficient and of poor quality, demanding larger quantities of higher purity. The Mitanni king Tushratta offered his daughter in marriage to the Egyptian pharaoh, expecting substantial gold payments in return for this diplomatic honor. The military infrastructure necessary to maintain imperial control required constant investment and innovation that pushed Egyptian engineering capabilities to their limits. Fortified bases along major trade routes housed permanent garrisons equipped with the latest weapons and communication systems available to ancient armies. Signal fires and messenger networks enabled rapid communication across the empire, allowing central authorities to respond quickly to local disturbances or external threats. The fortress at Zawiyet el-Rakam on the Mediterranean coast, over 300 kilometers west of the Nile Delta, included workshops for weapon production, stables for cavalry units, and administrative offices for coordinating military operations throughout the western frontier. This remote outpost, positioned to monitor Libyan tribal movements and protect Egyptian trade routes along the North African coast, demonstrates the extent of Egyptian military reach during the imperial period. The administrative machinery that governed this vast empire represented one of history's most sophisticated bureaucratic systems, capable of coordinating activities across thousands of kilometers while maintaining detailed records of every aspect of governmental operations. The vizier, typically holding the title mayor of the city and vizier of the south or vizier of the north, served as the pharaoh's chief administrator, responsible for tax collection, judicial proceedings, and provincial governance throughout his jurisdiction. The vizier's daily routine, recorded in tomb inscriptions that provide unprecedented insight into ancient administrative practices, began before dawn with reports from district governors, continued through court sessions, judging legal disputes and reviewing administrative decisions, and concluded with detailed briefings on military supplies, granary levels, and public works projects that required royal attention. Provincial administration operated through a hierarchy of appointed officials, answerable directly to the central government, creating chains of command that extended from the pharaoh's palace to the most remote villages of the empire. The king's son of Kush governed Nubia with vice-regal authority, commanding both military forces and civilian administrators throughout the southern territories. This official resided in a palace at Aniba that rivaled royal residences in Egypt, proper complete with throne rooms for receiving tribute and conducting official business, administrative offices staffed by trained scribes, and private apartments decorated with scenes of the pharaoh receiving tribute from Nubian chiefs. Similar administrative centers at Memphis controlled the Delta region, while Thebes remained the religious and ceremonial capital where the most important festivals and royal rituals took place. Tax collection operated through a complex system that assessed agricultural production, craft output, and trade revenues with mathematical precision that modern economists would recognize as sophisticated fiscal policy. Royal scribes conducted annual censuses, counting livestock, measuring field boundaries, and recording population figures that enabled accurate assessment of each district's productive capacity and tax obligations. The famous Wilbur Papyrus from the reign of Ramesses V provides detailed records of land holdings in Middle Egypt, listing individual farmers, their plot sizes, and tax obligations, calculated to the fraction of a grain measure. This bureaucratic thoroughness enabled the central government to extract resources efficiently, while maintaining detailed records of imperial finances that could be audited and verified by royal inspectors, dispatched to investigate suspected irregularities. The economic foundation of New Kingdom prosperity rested on three primary sources that together generated wealth exceeding that of any contemporary civilization: Nubian gold production, Near Eastern trade networks, and tributary payments from vassal states throughout the empire. These revenue streams funded the most ambitious construction projects in Egyptian history, while supporting military forces capable of projecting power throughout the ancient Near East. The temple complex at Karnak grew continuously throughout the New Kingdom, with successive pharaohs adding pylons, courtyards, and sanctuaries that eventually covered over 100 hectares, making it the largest religious complex ever constructed in the ancient world. The Great Hypostyle Hall, completed under Ramesses II, contained 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows, their capitals carved to represent papyrus flowers and lotus buds that symbolize the primordial marsh from which Egyptian mythology taught that creation had emerged. The central columns rose 23 meters high, their tops capable of supporting a platform large enough for 50 people to stand upon, demonstrating engineering capabilities that would not be matched in Europe until the construction of medieval cathedrals over 2 millennia later. Ramesses II ascended to the throne of Egypt around 1279 BC, inheriting an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile deep into Nubia to the contested borderlands of Syria, where Egyptian and Hittite interests collided with increasing frequency. His reign of 66 years, the second longest in Egyptian history, would witness the most dramatic military confrontation of the Bronze Age, the establishment of history's first recorded peace treaty between major powers, and construction projects so massive that they would define Egyptian civilization in the imagination of all subsequent generations. Ramesses was not merely a pharaoh, he was a force of nature, a living god whose ambitions matched the scale of the empire he ruled. The young pharaoh inherited a strategic situation that demanded immediate attention. The Hittite Empire, centered in the highlands of Anatolia, had expanded aggressively into Syria during the preceding decades, challenging Egyptian control over territories that had been under pharaonic authority since the conquests of Thutmose III. The Hittites possessed military capabilities that matched or exceeded Egyptian standards, including iron weapons that were beginning to replace bronze in their arsenals, chariot forces trained in tactics developed through generations of warfare against the diverse peoples of Anatolia, and diplomatic networks that had drawn many former Egyptian vassals into Hittite alliance systems. The confrontation between these two superpowers was inevitable, and both sides understood that the outcome would determine the balance of power throughout the ancient Near East for generations to come. Ramesses II prepared for the decisive campaign with characteristic thoroughness, assembling the largest Egyptian army ever deployed for a single military operation. The invasion force numbered approximately 20,000 infantry organized into 4 divisions, each named after a major Egyptian deity: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. These divisions operated as semi-independent tactical units, each with its own command structure, supply train, and supporting elements that enabled independent operations when circumstances required. The chariot corps, accompanying this massive infantry force, numbered approximately 5,000 vehicles, representing the largest concentration of mobile striking power ever assembled in the ancient world. Each chariot carried a driver and a warrior, armed with composite bow, javelins, and close combat weapons, creating a mobile weapons platform capable of devastating enemy formations through archery at range or shock action at close quarters. The Egyptian army began its march northward in the spring of 1274 BC, following the coastal route through Canaan that generations of pharaonic armies had used to project power into Syria. The advance proceeded smoothly through territories that had long acknowledged Egyptian authority, with local rulers providing supplies and intelligence about conditions further north. As the army approached the Orontes River and the strategic city of Kadesh, Ramesses II received reports from captured Bedouin scouts that the Hittite army under King Muwatalli II had retreated northward, apparently unwilling to confront Egyptian forces in open battle. The pharaoh, eager to press his advantage, ordered an accelerated advance that would bring his forces to Kadesh before the Hittites could organize effective resistance. This intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The Bedouin scouts were not random travelers, but Hittite agents deliberately planted to deceive the Egyptian command about enemy dispositions. Muwatalli II had not retreated northward. He had concealed his entire army, numbering approximately 40,000 troops, including 3,500 chariots, behind the city of Kadesh, waiting for the Egyptians to advance into a carefully prepared trap. The Hittite king understood that Egyptian military doctrine emphasized rapid advance and aggressive action, and he designed his deception to exploit these tendencies by encouraging Ramesses to push forward with his leading elements, while his main force remained strung out along the march route. Ramesses II, commanding the Amun division at the head of the Egyptian advance, crossed the Orontes River and established camp northwest of Kadesh, confident that he had achieved strategic surprise against a retreating enemy. The Ra division followed several kilometers behind, while the Ptah and Seth divisions remained even further to the rear, still completing their crossing of the river. At this moment of maximum Egyptian vulnerability, with the pharaoh's forces divided and unable to support each other, the Hittite trap was sprung. Muwatalli II launched his entire chariot force in a devastating attack against the Ra division, catching the Egyptian column in march formation and completely unprepared for combat. The Hittite chariot charge shattered the Ra division within minutes, scattering Egyptian soldiers across the plain, as the heavy Hittite vehicles, each carrying 3 warriors rather than the Egyptian standard of 2, crashed through their formations with irresistible momentum. Survivors fled northward toward the pharaoh's camp, spreading panic and confusion as they ran. The Hittite chariots pursued relentlessly, cutting down fleeing Egyptians and preventing any attempt to reorganize resistance. Within an hour of the initial attack, the Ra division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. and the Hittite chariots were approaching the camp of the Amun division where Ramesses II himself was located. The pharaoh's situation was desperate beyond any reasonable hope of survival. His personal guard numbered only a few hundred men, completely inadequate to resist the thousands of Hittite chariots now sweeping toward his position. The Amun division, caught in the process of establishing camp, could not form effective battle lines before the enemy arrived. The Ta and Seth divisions were too far away to provide timely assistance, and the destruction of the Ra division had eliminated any possibility of coordinated Egyptian response to the Hittite attack. By every rational military calculation, Ramesses II should have been killed or captured within the next hour, and the Egyptian army should have been destroyed in the greatest military disaster in pharaonic history. What happened next became the defining moment of Ramesses II's reign, and one of the most celebrated episodes in ancient military history. According to Egyptian accounts, which admittedly reflect royal propaganda, but are consistent with the battle's outcome, the pharaoh personally rallied his scattered forces and led a desperate counterattack against the Hittite chariots. Ramesses mounted his war chariot, took up his composite bow, and charged directly into the mass of enemy vehicles, his arrows finding their marks with deadly accuracy as his driver maneuvered through the chaos of battle. The pharaoh's personal courage inspired his surviving soldiers to stand and fight rather than flee, creating a nucleus of resistance that gradually stabilized the Egyptian position. The contemporary reliefs depicting the Battle of Kadesh, carved on temple walls throughout Egypt, show Ramesses II standing alone in his chariot, his powerful bow drawn as enemy chariots swirl around him from every direction. His horses rear dramatically as arrows fill the air, while fallen Hittite warriors and overturned chariots litter the ground around him. These images, while certainly exaggerated for propaganda purposes, capture the essential truth of the battle. The pharaoh's personal leadership at the moment of crisis prevented complete Egyptian defeat and enabled the survival of forces that would eventually turn the tide of the engagement. The arrival of Egyptian reinforcements transformed the battle's dynamics at the critical moment. A force of elite troops, possibly the Naarin contingent that had been approaching Kadesh by a different route, struck the Hittite flank just as the enemy chariots were becoming disorganized by their pursuit of fleeing Egyptians and their assault on the pharaoh's position. This unexpected attack threw the Hittite command into confusion, forcing Muwatalli II to recall his chariots to meet this new threat rather than completing the destruction of the Egyptian camp. The respite, however brief, allowed Ramesses II to reorganize his surviving forces and establish defensive positions that the Hittites could not easily overwhelm. The battle continued throughout the afternoon, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage. The Hittites launched repeated chariot attacks against Egyptian positions, but the reorganized Egyptian forces, fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew that defeat meant death, repulsed each assault with heavy casualties on both sides. The arrival of the PTH division late in the day further strengthened Egyptian positions, while Hittite losses in chariots and experienced warriors made continued offensive operations increasingly costly. As darkness fell, both armies withdrew to lick their wounds and assess the day's catastrophic events. The Battle of Kadesh ended without clear victory for either side, though both claimed triumph in their official accounts. Egyptian records portrayed Ramesses II as a divine warrior who had single-handedly defeated the entire Hittite army, while Hittite accounts emphasized the destruction of the Ra division and the near capture of the Egyptian pharaoh. The strategic reality was that neither empire had achieved its objectives. Egypt had not conquered Kadesh or extended its control over northern Syria, While the Hittites had not destroyed the Egyptian army or eliminated Egyptian influence in the Levant, the battle demonstrated that the two superpowers were roughly equal in military capability, and that neither could achieve decisive victory over the other at such distances from their respective heartlands. The military stalemate that followed Kadesh lasted for over 15 years, with both empires conducting limited operations in the contested Syrian territories without achieving significant territorial changes. The costs of continued warfare, combined with emerging threats from other directions, gradually convinced both Egyptian and Hittite leadership that negotiated settlement offered better prospects than continued military confrontation. The Hittites faced pressure from Assyrian expansion in the east, while Egypt confronted increasing Libyan incursions along its western frontier. Both empires recognized that their resources would be better employed against these emerging threats than in endless warfare against each other over Syrian territories of limited strategic value. The Egyptian-Hittite Treaty of 1259 BC represented a diplomatic achievement as remarkable as any military victory, establishing the first recorded peace agreement between major powers in human history. The treaty, preserved in both hieroglyphic and cuneiform versions that demonstrate its bilateral nature, established precise territorial boundaries that recognized Egyptian control over southern Syria and Palestine, while acknowledging Hittite dominance in northern Syria and Anatolia. Both empires agreed to mutual defense arrangements that required military assistance against common enemies, creating an alliance system that would maintain stability throughout the eastern Mediterranean for the remainder of the Bronze Age. The treaty's provisions extended far beyond simple territorial arrangements to address the full range of issues that could create conflict between the two empires. Extradition clauses required both parties to return political refugees who fled across the border, eliminating the possibility that either empire could harbor dissidents or pretenders who might destabilize the other. Trade agreements established protocols for commercial relationships that would benefit merchants from both kingdoms while preventing economic disputes from escalating into military confrontation. The treaty even included provisions for royal marriages that would cement the alliance through family connections, leading to Ramesses II's marriage to a Hittite princess who received the Egyptian name Pharaohs and was honored with her own temple at Abu Simbel. The peace with the Hittites enabled Ramesses II to redirect Egyptian resources toward the monumental construction projects that would define his reign and establish his reputation as the greatest builder in Egyptian history. The temple complex at Abu Simbel, carved directly from living rock on the west bank of the Nile in Nubia, represented the pinnacle of New Kingdom architectural achievement and imperial propaganda. The temple's facade featured 4 colossal statues of the pharaoh, each standing 20 meters tall, their massive forms dominating the landscape for kilometers in every direction. The positioning of the temple ensured that all river traffic entering Egypt from Nubia would pass directly before these overwhelming images of pharaonic power, receiving an unmistakable message about the might of the ruler they were approaching. The interior of Abu Simbel extended 65 meters into the cliff face, its walls covered with detailed reliefs depicting Egyptian military victories, religious ceremonies, and the divine nature of the pharaoh who had commissioned this extraordinary monument. The temple's orientation was calculated with astronomical precision to ensure that twice each year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, the rising sun would penetrate the entire length of the temple to illuminate the statues of the gods seated in the innermost sanctuary. This solar alignment, achieved through engineering calculations of remarkable sophistication, demonstrated Egyptian mastery of astronomical knowledge while reinforcing the religious symbolism that connected the pharaoh with the sun god Ra. The construction projects undertaken during Ramesses II's reign employed tens of thousands of workers and consumed resources on a scale that would not be matched until the Industrial Age. Stone quarries in the eastern desert operated year-round, with teams of workers extracting granite, sandstone, and other building materials under military supervision that ensured steady production regardless of the harsh conditions. Transport ships specially designed for heavy cargo carried massive obelisks and architectural elements down the Nile, their movements coordinated with flood seasons to ensure adequate water levels for navigation. The logistics of moving a single obelisk from Aswan to Thebes involved hundreds of workers, specialized equipment, and months of careful planning that demonstrated the organizational capabilities of the pharaonic state. The Ramesseum, Ramesses II's mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, covered an area of approximately 10,000 square meters and included not only the temple proper, but also extensive storage facilities, administrative offices, and workshops that supported the temple's religious and economic functions. The temple's entrance was guarded by a colossal statue of the pharaoh, originally standing over 17 meters tall and weighing approximately 1,000 tons, making it one of the largest monolithic statues ever carved. This statue, now fallen and broken, inspired Percy Bysshe Shelley's famous poem Ozymandias, which used the ruined monument as a meditation on the transience of earthly power and the inevitable decay of even the mightiest empires. The sophisticated administrative machinery and military infrastructure that had sustained Egyptian imperial dominance for nearly 2 centuries faced its most severe internal challenge during the reign of Amenhotep IV, who would later rename himself Akhenaten. What this pharaoh did to his own kingdom was so radical, so destructive, and so incomprehensible to his contemporaries that they would spend generations trying to erase every trace of his existence from Egyptian memory. His religious revolution did not merely change how Egyptians worshiped their gods. It systematically dismantled the economic, political, and social foundations upon which New Kingdom prosperity had been built. In attempting to transform Egyptian civilization according to his personal religious vision, Akhenaten nearly destroyed it entirely. Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne around 1353 BC, inheriting an empire at its territorial and economic zenith. His father, Amenhotep III, had ruled for 38 years of unprecedented peace and prosperity, maintaining Egyptian dominance through diplomatic marriages, tribute collection, and the accumulated military reputation of his predecessors. The new pharaoh initially followed conventional patterns, appearing in traditional regalia and participating in established religious ceremonies at Thebes. Nothing in his early reign suggested the revolutionary transformation that would soon convulse Egyptian society. But within 5 years of his accession, Amenhotep IV had initiated the most radical religious transformation in Egyptian history, a transformation that would have consequences far beyond the spiritual realm. The traditional Egyptian religious system that Akhenaten sought to destroy had evolved over millennia into a complex theological framework that permeated every aspect of Egyptian life. The worship of Amun-Ra as the supreme deity, supported by an extensive pantheon including Ptah, Thoth, Hathor, and hundreds of lesser gods and goddesses, provided the ideological foundation that justified pharaonic authority and maintained social order throughout the kingdom. The priests of Amun at Karnak had accumulated enormous wealth and political influence over centuries, controlling vast temple estates that encompassed approximately 1/3 of Egypt's agricultural land, managing international trade relationships that generated substantial revenues, and serving as key advisors to the pharaoh on matters of state policy. These priests were not merely religious functionaries, they were the administrators of an economic empire within the empire, wielding power that rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of the royal court itself. Akhenaten's religious revolution began with the elevation of the Aten, represented as a solar disk with rays ending in human hands, to supreme status above all other deities. Initially, this appeared to be merely another example of pharaonic preference for a particular god, similar to earlier rulers who had promoted their favored deities while maintaining the traditional pantheon. But by his 6th regnal year, Akhenaten had declared the Aten to be the sole legitimate deity, ordering the closure of traditional temples throughout Egypt, and the cessation of worship for all other gods. This was not religious reform, this was religious annihilation. The pharaoh was not adding a new god to the Egyptian pantheon, he was attempting to erase thousands of years of religious tradition and replace it with something entirely new. The theological implications of this transformation extended far beyond religious practice into the fundamental structure of Egyptian society and governance. Traditional Egyptian religion provided the ideological framework that justified pharaonic authority, with the king serving as the earthly representative of the gods and the intermediary between divine and human realms. The complex mythology surrounding Osiris, Isis, and Horus established the pharaoh's divine nature through his identification with Horus, the son of Osiris who had avenged his father's murder and restored cosmic order. The elaborate funerary practices centered on Osiris worship guaranteed eternal life for both rulers and subjects, providing the ultimate reward for those who lived according to Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order and justice that governed Egyptian civilization. Atenism rejected these fundamental concepts entirely, presenting the Aten as a universal deity accessible only through Akhenaten himself. The pharaoh claimed exclusive communication with the Aten, positioning himself as the sole intermediary between the god and humanity. This theological innovation eliminated the traditional priestly hierarchy that had mediated between gods and worshippers for thousands of years, concentrating all religious authority in the person of the pharaoh, while simultaneously undermining the mythological foundations of divine kingship. The priests of Amun, Ta, Thoth, and every other traditional deity suddenly found themselves not merely unemployed, but actively persecuted, their temples closed, their revenues confiscated, and their very existence declared illegitimate by royal decree. The economic consequences of this religious transformation proved immediately devastating to established institutions throughout Egypt. The temples of traditional deities controlled approximately 1/3 of Egypt's agricultural land, employed thousands of priests, scribes, and craftsmen, and managed extensive trading networks that connected Egypt with foreign markets. Akhenaten's closure of these temples eliminated their economic activity overnight, creating unemployment for skilled workers and disrupting commercial relationships that had operated for generations. The Karnak temple complex alone employed over 80,000 people in various capacities, from high priests and temple scribes to agricultural workers and craft specialists. These individuals possessed specialized knowledge and skills that had been passed down through family lines for centuries, creating a professional class whose expertise became suddenly obsolete under the new religious system. The pharaoh's agents systematically defaced traditional religious inscriptions throughout Egypt, chiseling out the names of Amun and other deities from temple walls, royal monuments, and private tombs. This campaign of destruction extended even to the cartouches of Akhenaten's own father, Amenhotep III, whose name contained the element Amun and was therefore targeted for erasure. The systematic nature of this iconoclasm demonstrated the thoroughness of Akhenaten's revolutionary vision and the resources he was willing to devote to its implementation. Teams of workers traveled throughout Egypt, climbing scaffolding to reach inscriptions high on temple walls. entering private tombs to deface family monuments, and destroying religious texts that had been copied and preserved for millennia. The cultural destruction was incalculable, eliminating artistic and literary works that could never be recovered. Akhenaten's decision to abandon Thebes and construct a new capital at Akhetaten represented the physical manifestation of his religious revolution. The site, located on the east bank of the Nile approximately 300 kilometers north of Thebes, had no previous religious or political significance, allowing the pharaoh to create an entirely new urban center dedicated exclusively to Aten worship. The city's construction began around his 5th regnal year and proceeded with remarkable speed, utilizing corvée labor from throughout Egypt to build palaces, temples, administrative buildings, and residential districts. The scale of construction was staggering. Within 5 years, a complete city capable of housing tens of thousands of inhabitants had risen from empty desert, its buildings decorated with artistic representations that broke dramatically with traditional Egyptian conventions. The Great Temple of the Aten, at Akhetaten, differed fundamentally from traditional Egyptian temple architecture in ways that reflected the theological innovations of Atenism. Instead of the enclosed, darkened sanctuaries that characterized temples to Amun and other deities, the Aten temple consisted of open courtyards exposed to sunlight, reflecting the solar nature of the deity. The temple complex extended over 800 meters in length, containing multiple offering tables where priests presented food offerings directly under the sun's rays. This architectural innovation eliminated the mysterious, hidden aspects of traditional Egyptian worship, creating a more direct relationship between deity and worshipper, while simultaneously eliminating the priestly intermediaries who had controlled access to the divine in traditional temples. The royal palace at Akhetaten covered approximately 15 hectares, its walls decorated with scenes depicting Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their 6 daughters worshipping the Aten in informal family settings. These artistic representations marked a dramatic departure from traditional pharaonic iconography, showing the royal family in relaxed poses, embracing their children, and participating in daily activities that would never have been depicted in earlier Egyptian art. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, exemplifies the artistic revolution that accompanied Atenism, with its realistic portrayal of individual features rather than the idealized representations typical of earlier Egyptian art. The queen's elongated neck, full lips, and distinctive facial structure are rendered with a naturalism that would not be seen again in Western art until the Renaissance. The administrative challenges of governing from Akhetaten while maintaining control over a vast empire proved insurmountable for Akhenaten's government. The pharaoh's obsession with religious transformation led to the neglect of foreign policy and military affairs, creating opportunities for Egypt's enemies to challenge established territorial arrangements. The Amarna letters, discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, document the deteriorating situation in the Levant with heartbreaking clarity. Local rulers who had faithfully served Egyptian interests for generations sent desperate appeals for military assistance against expanding Hittite influence and internal rebellions, only to receive vague promises and minimal support from a pharaoh more interested in theological innovation than imperial defense. Ribhada, ruler of Byblos and one of Egypt's most loyal vassals, sent over 50 letters to Akhetaten describing Hittite-supported attacks on Egyptian territories in Syria and Palestine. His correspondence reveals growing desperation as Egyptian garrisons were withdrawn from frontier posts and redeployed to construction projects at the new capital. Ribhada's letters describe enemy forces capturing Egyptian strongholds, intercepting tribute caravans and encouraging other vassal states to abandon their allegiance to Egypt. "The king, my lord, does not know that I am in a very difficult situation," he wrote in one letter. "All the lands of the king, my lord, are lost." The pharaoh's responses, when they came at all, consisted of vague promises and minimal military support that did nothing to address the strategic collapse occurring throughout Egyptian territories. The collapse of Egyptian authority in the Levant had immediate economic consequences for the empire. Tribute payments from Syrian and Palestinian vassals ceased as local rulers either joined anti-Egyptian coalitions or were conquered by Hittite-supported forces. Trade routes that had generated substantial revenues for the Egyptian treasury came under enemy control, disrupting commercial networks that connected Egypt with Mesopotamian and Anatolian markets. The loss of these revenues occurred precisely when the pharaoh's construction projects at Akhetaten demanded enormous financial resources, creating fiscal pressures that further weakened the Egyptian state's ability to respond to external threats. Akhenaten's religious policies also created internal resistance from traditional Egyptian elites who had built their careers and fortunes within the established religious system. The powerful priesthood of Amun at Thebes possessed extensive political connections throughout the government bureaucracy, the military officer corps, and provincial administration. These individuals viewed Atenism not merely as theological innovation, but as a direct threat to their economic interests and social status. The pharaoh's response to this opposition involved systematic purges of government officials suspected of maintaining loyalty to traditional religious practices. Archaeological evidence from Akhetaten suggests that many high-ranking officials relocated to the new capital under compulsion rather than choice, abandoning established estates and social networks in Thebes and Memphis. The disruption of these administrative relationships weakened the government's ability to collect taxes, maintain public order, and coordinate military operations. Military commanders faced particular difficulties under the new system, as traditional Egyptian military ideology incorporated religious elements that Atenism rejected. Egyptian soldiers had traditionally fought under the protection of specific deities, carrying standards depicting gods associated with their units and participating in religious ceremonies before major campaigns. The elimination of these practices undermined military morale and unit cohesion, contributing to the empire's military difficulties in foreign territories. Soldiers who had believed they fought with divine protection now faced enemies without the psychological comfort that traditional religious practices had provided. The succession crisis that began during Akhenaten's final years reflected the broader institutional breakdown caused by his religious revolution. The pharaoh's heir apparent, a shadowy figure known as Smenkhkare, appears to have ruled briefly as co-regent before disappearing from historical records around 1336 BC. The circumstances surrounding Smenkhare's reign remain unclear, with some evidence suggesting he attempted to restore traditional religious practices while maintaining Akhenaten's theological innovations. His sudden disappearance, whether through death, deposition, or voluntary withdrawal, left the succession in chaos at precisely the moment when strong leadership was most desperately needed. Tutankhamun, who ascended to the throne as a child of approximately 9 years, inherited an empire in crisis. The young pharaoh's reign began at Akhetaten under the guidance of powerful advisors, including Ai, who had served in Akhenaten's administration, and Horemheb, a military commander who had maintained Egyptian positions in the Levant during the worst period of imperial decline. These regions faced the enormous challenge of restoring governmental functionality while managing the religious and political consequences of Akhenaten's revolution. Their task was nothing less than rebuilding Egyptian civilization from the wreckage that Akhenaten had created. The restoration process began with Tutankhamun's return to Thebes and the systematic reopening of traditional temples throughout Egypt. The young pharaoh's restoration stela, discovered at Karnak, describes the deplorable condition of Egypt's religious institutions in terms that reveal the full extent of Akhenaten's destructive legacy. The temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine to the marshes of the Delta had fallen into neglect, the inscription declares. Their shrines had become desolate, overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never existed. Their halls were footpaths. The document presents the restoration as a divine mandate to repair the damage caused by the preceding reign's religious policies, carefully avoiding direct criticism of Akhenaten, while making clear that his innovations had been catastrophic for Egyptian civilization. The economic aspects of restoration required careful negotiation between competing interests that threatened to tear the fragile recovery apart. The traditional priesthoods demanded full restoration of their temple estates and economic privileges, arguing that only the return of their former wealth could enable proper worship of the gods whose anger had brought such disaster upon Egypt. The royal treasury, however, lacked sufficient resources to fund both restoration projects and ongoing governmental operations. Having been drained by Akhenaten's construction projects and the loss of imperial revenues, Tutankhamun's administration developed a compromise solution that restored temple operations while maintaining royal control over their most valuable assets, particularly gold mines and international trading relationships. This arrangement satisfied neither party completely, but prevented the open conflict that might have destroyed the restoration before it could take hold. The systematic destruction of Amarna period records began during Tutankhamun's reign and intensified under his successors. Royal agents removed Akhenaten's name from king lists, defaced his monuments, and dismantled buildings at Akhetaten for use in construction projects elsewhere. This damnatio memoriae extended to other members of Akhenaten's family, with Nefertiti and Smenkhare disappearing from official records as thoroughly as if they had never existed. The thoroughness of this erasure was so complete that Akhenaten's existence remained unknown to later generations of Egyptians, and his rediscovery by modern archaeologists came as a complete surprise to scholars who had believed they understood Egyptian history. Ai's brief reign of 4 years continued the restoration process while consolidating the political changes initiated under Tutankhamun. As an elderly courtier who had served both Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, Ai possessed detailed knowledge of pre-revolution administrative procedures and international relationships that proved invaluable for rebuilding Egyptian governmental capabilities. His correspondence with foreign rulers, preserved in fragmentary form, demonstrates efforts to restore Egypt's diplomatic credibility and rebuild the tributary relationships that had sustained imperial prosperity. The military situation required immediate attention, as Hittite forces continued expanding into territories that Egypt had controlled for over a century. Ai's generals conducted limited campaigns in southern Palestine and Nubia, achieving sufficient success to discourage further enemy advances, while avoiding the massive military commitments that the weakened Egyptian state could not sustain. Horemheb's accession to the throne around 1323 BC brought military expertise and administrative experience to the restoration effort that his predecessors had lacked. As a career military officer who had witnessed the empire's decline firsthand, Horemheb understood both the external threats facing Egypt and the internal reforms necessary to address them. His Edict of Horemheb, inscribed on a stela at Karnak, outlines comprehensive administrative reforms designed to eliminate the corruption and inefficiency that had developed during the Amarna period. The edict addresses specific problems that had emerged during the preceding decades: military officers extorting supplies from civilian populations, tax collectors embezzling revenues, and court officials accepting bribes for favorable legal decisions. Horemheb's solutions involved the establishment of new oversight mechanisms, the creation of appellate courts to review local judicial decisions, and the implementation of standardized procedures for tax collection and military supply procurement. The cultural impact of the Amarna period extended beyond immediate political and economic consequences to influence Egyptian artistic expression, architectural design, and literary production for generations. The realistic artistic style developed under Akhenaten continued to influence royal portraiture, while the open temple architecture, pioneered at Akhenaten, appeared in later construction projects. However, the theological innovations of Atenism disappeared completely, leaving no trace in subsequent Egyptian religious development. The priests who had survived Akhenaten's persecution ensured that his religious ideas would never again threaten traditional Egyptian worship, incorporating safeguards into temple rituals and theological texts that emphasized the eternal validity of traditional practices. The international consequences of Egypt's internal crisis permanently altered the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The Hittite Empire expanded its influence throughout Syria and northern Palestine, establishing client kingdoms that blocked Egyptian access to Mesopotamian trade routes. Assyria exploited Egyptian weakness to extend its control over territories in the upper Euphrates region, while Nubian vassals began asserting greater independence from central authority. These territorial losses reduced Egypt's tribute income and eliminated strategic positions that had been essential for maintaining imperial dominance. The restoration efforts of Horemheb and his successors had stabilized Egypt's internal administration and restored some measure of imperial prestige, but the empire that emerged from the Amarna crisis was fundamentally weaker than the one that had entered it. By 1200 BC, a far more devastating threat emerged from the northern waters of the eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples, as Egyptian scribes would later identify them, represented not a single unified force, but a confederation of maritime raiders whose coordinated attacks would shatter the established order throughout the ancient world. Their invasions coincided with the broader phenomenon historians term the Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophic period that witnessed the destruction of major civilizations from Greece to Mesopotamia. The world that the pharaohs had known, the world of great empires and international diplomacy, of bronze weapons and chariot warfare, was about to end in fire and blood. The first Egyptian encounters with these seaborne invaders occurred during the reign of Merneptah, son and successor of Ramesses II. Around 1208 BC, Egyptian frontier posts in the western delta reported massive population movements along the Mediterranean coast, with displaced peoples moving eastward in unprecedented numbers. These were not typical nomadic migrations but organized movements involving entire populations traveling with their families, livestock, and portable possessions in ox-drawn carts, accompanied by fleets of ships carrying armed warriors. Something terrible was happening in the lands beyond Egypt's borders, something that was driving entire peoples from their homes and sending them crashing against Egyptian defenses like waves against a seawall. Merneptah's scribes recorded the names of these foreign groups with careful attention to their distinctive characteristics and origins. The Shurden, recognizable by their distinctive horned helmets and round shields, had previously served as mercenaries in Egyptian armies, but now appeared as hostile invaders. The Luka, originating from the Anatolian coast, brought expertise in naval warfare and siege techniques that posed unprecedented challenges to Egyptian defensive preparations. The Tersha, possibly related to later Etruscan populations, demonstrated sophisticated metallurgical knowledge and advanced weapon-making capabilities. These were not primitive barbarians, but sophisticated warriors from advanced civilizations, driven by desperation to seek new homes in lands that still offered hope of survival. The Libyan Confederation that threatened Egypt's western borders had incorporated substantial numbers of these sea peoples, creating a formidable alliance that combined traditional desert warfare tactics with advanced maritime technology. The Libyan king Merii assembled a force estimated at over 20,000 warriors, including 2,600 Sherdun, 2,200 Shekelesh, and smaller contingents of other Sea Peoples groups. This coalition possessed bronze weapons superior to many Egyptian armaments, composite bows with greater range and accuracy than standard Egyptian models, and tactical knowledge gained from campaigns throughout the Mediterranean. The threat they posed was existential. If they broke through Egyptian defenses, there would be nothing to stop them from conquering the entire Nile Valley. The decisive confrontation occurred near Pereire in the western delta, where Merneptah's forces engaged the invading coalition in a battle that lasted 6 hours and resulted in over 6,000 enemy casualties. Egyptian records describe the pharaoh personally leading his chariot forces in repeated charges against enemy formations, his golden armor gleaming as arrows darkened the sky above the battlefield. The Egyptian victory proved decisive but costly, with substantial losses among elite chariot units and evidence that only superior numbers and defensive positions had prevented Egyptian defeat. The captured enemy equipment revealed technological innovations that concerned Egyptian military commanders. Sea Peoples warriors carried iron weapons alongside traditional bronze armaments, demonstrating knowledge of metallurgical techniques that Egyptian smiths had not yet mastered. Most disturbing of all were the reports from interrogated prisoners, who described the complete destruction of major cities throughout the Aegean and Anatolian regions. The great palace centers of Mycenaean Greece, including Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae itself, had been destroyed. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and recent ally, was collapsing under attacks from multiple directions. The entire Bronze Age world was dying, and Egypt stood alone against the tide of destruction that was sweeping across the ancient Near East. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean confirms the catastrophic nature of these population movements. The great palace centers of Mycenaean Greece show clear signs of violent destruction around 1200 BC. These were not isolated raids, but systematic attacks that eliminated entire administrative systems, destroyed written records, and scattered populations across vast distances. The Linear B tablets from Pylos record desperate preparations for siege, including orders to coastal watchers and the mobilization of bronzesmiths to produce weapons before the site's final destruction. The last tablets ever written at Pylos describe the deployment of rowers to defend the coast, a final desperate measure that proved utterly inadequate against the forces arrayed against them. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's primary rival for control of Syrian territories, faced even more devastating attacks from multiple directions. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, suffered complete destruction around 1180 BC, its massive fortifications breached, and its palace complex burned so thoroughly that the conflagration melted bronze artifacts and cracked stone foundations. Hittite records from the empire's final years describe coordinated attacks by land and sea, with enemy forces appearing simultaneously along the Anatolian coast and advancing overland through the Caucasus Mountains. The great empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh simply ceased to exist. Its cities burned, its people scattered, its very name forgotten, until modern archaeologists rediscovered its remains. The collapse of Hittite power created a power vacuum in Syria and northern Palestine that various groups rushed to fill. The Arameans, Semitic-speaking peoples from the Syrian desert, established kingdoms in Damascus, Hamath, and other strategic locations, while Assyrian forces expanded westward to claim former Hittite territories in the upper Euphrates region. These developments eliminated the buffer states that had protected Egyptian interests in the Levant, forcing Egypt to defend extended frontiers with reduced military resources. The international system that had maintained stability throughout the late Bronze Age had collapsed completely, leaving Egypt alone among the great powers of the ancient world. Ramesses III, who ascended to the Egyptian throne around 1186 BC, inherited this deteriorating strategic situation and proved himself the last great warrior pharaoh of the new kingdom. His reign would witness the most intensive period of Sea People's attacks on Egypt itself, requiring unprecedented military mobilization and innovative defensive strategies. The pharaoh's scribes recorded his preparations with characteristic Egyptian attention to detail, describing the construction of new fortifications along the Delta coast and the establishment of naval bases equipped with purpose-built warships. Ramesses III understood that the threat he faced was unlike anything Egypt had confronted before, and he prepared accordingly. The great invasion of Ramesses III's 8th regnal year represented the climax of Sea People's pressure on Egypt. Contemporary records describe a coordinated assault involving both land and naval forces, with the enemy coalition advancing simultaneously along the Palestinian coast and through the Mediterranean Sea. The land component included the Peliset, who would later establish themselves as the biblical Philistines, along with contingents of Cheker, Denyen, and Weshesh warriors. Their families traveled in massive ox-drawn carts, indicating their intention to establish permanent settlements rather than conduct temporary raids. These were not raiders seeking plunder. They were migrants seeking new homes, and they would fight with the desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. The naval battle depicted in extraordinary detail on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu showcases Egyptian defensive innovations and tactical adaptations that proved decisive in repelling the invasion. Egyptian ships modified with elevated fighting platforms and reinforced prows engaged Sea People's vessels in close combat, while archers on shore provided supporting fire. The reliefs show Egyptian Marines boarding enemy ships with bronze axes and short swords, while enemy warriors, identifiable by their distinctive feathered headdresses and geometric shield patterns, fight desperately to maintain their vessel formations. The battle was brutal, close-quarters combat where individual courage and skill determined survival. The artistic representations at Medinet Habu provide unprecedented detail about Sea People's appearance and equipment. Pelset warriors wore distinctive feathered headdresses with geometric patterns, carried small round shields, and fought with straight swords and javelins. Their ships featured high prows, decorated with bird heads, square sails for long-distance travel, and rowing positions for up to 30 oarsmen. The reliefs also show enemy families in their ox carts, women and children traveling with household possessions, pottery, and livestock, emphasizing the migration nature of these movements. These were not armies of conquest but entire peoples on the move, seeking survival in a world that was collapsing around them. The land battle occurred near the Egyptian fortress of Jahi in southern Palestine, where Ramesses III had concentrated his available forces to intercept the enemy advance. Egyptian records claimed total victory, with over 12,500 enemy casualties, and the capture of numerous prisoners who were subsequently settled in Egyptian territory as agricultural workers and military colonists. However, the strategic situation remained precarious, as Egyptian forces lacked sufficient strength to pursue retreating enemies or re-establish control over lost territories. The victory had saved Egypt from conquest, but it had not restored Egyptian dominance over the Levant. The aftermath of these campaigns revealed the fundamental changes that Sea Peoples' invasions had wrought throughout the region. The Peliset established themselves along the southern Palestinian coast, founding the cities that would become Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron. These settlements featured distinctive pottery styles, architectural techniques, and burial practices that reflected Aegean origins while adapting to local conditions. The Peliset military organization, based on professional warrior bands rather than territorial militias, proved highly effective in subsequent conflicts with neighboring peoples, including the Israelites, whose biblical accounts preserve memories of these formidable enemies. Egyptian territorial losses accelerated following Ramesses III's campaigns, as the Pharaohs' forces proved incapable of maintaining garrisons throughout the traditional imperial territories. The great fortress of Megiddo, which had controlled the vital Jezreel Valley since Thutmose III's conquest, was abandoned around 1150 BC, as Egyptian administrators withdrew to more defensible positions closer to the homeland. Similar evacuations occurred throughout Syria and Palestine, with Egyptian forces retreating to a handful of coastal strongholds that could be supplied by sea. The empire that Thutmose III had built through decades of conquest was dissolving, and there was nothing the pharaohs could do to stop it. The economic consequences of these territorial losses compounded Egypt's military difficulties. Tribute payments from Syrian and Palestinian vassals had provided substantial revenues for the royal treasury, while the loss of trade routes eliminated commercial taxes and customs duties that had sustained imperial administration. The disruption of tin supplies from Anatolia and Cyprus created particular problems for Egyptian bronze production, forcing military commanders to implement strict rationing of metal weapons and tools. The Bronze Age was ending not just politically but technologically, as the trade networks that had supplied the raw materials for bronze production collapsed along with the civilizations that had maintained them. The broader Bronze Age collapse phenomenon extended far beyond the Eastern Mediterranean to affect civilizations throughout the ancient world. The Indus Valley civilization experienced similar disruptions around this period, with major urban centers abandoned and trade networks collapsed. In Europe, the Urnfield culture emerged from the chaos of Bronze Age destruction, introducing new burial practices and settlement patterns that reflected fundamental social changes. Even distant China experienced political upheaval during this period, with the Western Zhou dynasty replacing the Shang rulers amid evidence of widespread warfare and population displacement. Something had gone terribly wrong with the entire Bronze Age world, and no civilization, however powerful, proved immune to its effects. The causes of this civilizational collapse remain subjects of scholarly debate, with proposed explanations ranging from climate change and natural disasters to technological innovations and social revolutions. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced severe drought conditions around 1200 BC, potentially disrupting agricultural production and forcing population movements. The introduction of iron technology may have destabilized existing military balances, while social tensions within Bronze Age palace societies might have contributed to internal collapse. Egyptian records from this period describe unusual weather patterns, including failed Nile floods and extended periods of low rainfall in normally fertile regions. The cannibal hymn texts from this era reference widespread famine and social disorder, while administrative documents record emergency grain distributions and the suspension of normal tax collection procedures. The religious and cultural impact of the Sea People's invasions extended beyond immediate military consequences to influence Egyptian worldview and artistic expression. Traditional Egyptian concepts of cosmic order, which portrayed Egypt as the center of a stable, divinely ordained world, required fundamental revision in light of the widespread destruction and chaos throughout the known world. Temple inscriptions from this period reflect increased emphasis on protective deities and defensive magical practices, while artistic representations show greater attention to fortifications and military preparations. The confident imperialism of the early New Kingdom had given way to a defensive mentality focused on survival rather than expansion. The assassination of Ramesses III around 1155 BC, the result of a palace conspiracy involving royal wives and court officials, symbolized the internal decay that accompanied external military pressures. The conspiracy, documented in judicial papyri that survived from the subsequent trials, revealed deep divisions within the royal court and growing dissatisfaction with the pharaoh's military policies. The successful elimination of the pharaoh demonstrated that even the most fundamental institutions of Egyptian monarchy had been weakened by the ongoing crisis. If a pharaoh could be murdered by his own household, what security remained for anyone in Egypt? The death of Ramesses the 11th, around 1077 BC, marked the end of unified pharaonic authority that had governed Egypt for over 15 centuries. The last ruler of the 20th dynasty died in Memphis, while actual control over southern Egypt rested with Herhor, the high priest of Amun at Thebes, who had assumed royal prerogatives including the right to enclose his name in cartouches and date official documents to his own regnal years. This unprecedented division of royal authority between the nominal pharaoh in the north and the Theban priesthood in the south established a pattern of political fragmentation that would characterize Egyptian governance for the next 4 centuries. Egypt, which had been the most centralized state in the ancient world, was splitting apart. The emergence of dual authority centers reflected fundamental changes in Egypt's economic and administrative structures that had developed during the later New Kingdom. The Theban priesthood had accumulated enormous wealth through temple endowments, foreign tribute, and control over Nubian gold mines, creating an independent power base that rivaled royal authority. The priests controlled vast agricultural estates throughout Upper Egypt, maintained their own military forces, and conducted diplomatic relations with Nubian rulers without reference to the northern court. By Ramesses Shi's final years, the high priest of Amun effectively governed all territory south of Memphis as an autonomous ruler, pharaoh in all but name. Smendis, who established the 21st dynasty at Tanis around 1077 BC, inherited control over Lower Egypt and the Delta region, but lacked the resources to challenge Theban independence. The new pharaoh ruled from Tanis, rather than the traditional capitals of Memphis or Thebes, reflecting both the practical limitations of his authority and the strategic importance of the northeastern delta for defending against Asiatic invasions. Tanis had served as a military base during the Ramesside period, its location near the Pelusiac branch of the Nile providing access to Mediterranean trade routes while maintaining defensive positions against potential threats from Palestine. The archaeological remains at Tanis reveal the reduced circumstances of 21st dynasty pharaohs compared to their New Kingdom predecessors. The royal tombs, constructed within the temple precinct rather than in separate necropolises, utilized recycled blocks and architectural elements from earlier monuments. Susens I, who ruled from approximately 1047 to 1001 BC, was buried in a silver coffin, placed within a granite sarcophagus originally carved for a 19th dynasty official. His funerary equipment, while rich in precious metals, lacked the artistic sophistication and monumental scale that had characterized royal burials during Egypt's imperial period. The pharaohs of Tanis were wealthy by ordinary standards, but they were shadows of the god-kings who had ruled from Thebes and Memphis during Egypt's golden age. The Theban rulers maintained the fiction of subservience to the Tanite pharaohs through carefully crafted diplomatic protocols that acknowledged northern supremacy while preserving southern autonomy. Official documents from Thebes dated events to both the high priest's tenure and the reigning pharaoh's regnal years, creating a complex chronological system that reflected the political reality of divided authority. Marriage alliances between the royal families of Tanis and the priestly dynasties of Thebes provided additional legitimacy for this arrangement, while preventing open conflict between the two power centers. The arrangement was awkward and unprecedented, but it worked well enough to maintain stability for several generations. Pinugem I, who served as high priest of Amun from approximately 1070 to 1032 BC, exemplified the evolution of Theban authority during this period. Initially appointed by Smens as a royal representative, Pinugem gradually assumed full pharaonic titles and prerogatives, including the construction of royal monuments and the performance of religious ceremonies traditionally reserved for the pharaoh. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu incorporated architectural elements and decorative programs that explicitly claimed royal status, while his mummy, discovered in the royal cache at Dar el-Bahri, received burial treatment identical to that accorded legitimate pharaohs. The high priests of Amun had become pharaohs in their own right, ruling southern Egypt as an independent kingdom while maintaining nominal allegiance to their northern counterparts. The economic foundation of this divided authority rested on the control of specific revenue sources that had sustained Egyptian prosperity during the imperial period. The Tanite pharaohs controlled the delta's agricultural production, Mediterranean trade routes, and whatever remained of Egypt's Asiatic territories, while the Theban priesthood managed Upper Egyptian agriculture, Nubian gold extraction, and the extensive temple estates that generated substantial annual revenues. This division created two competing economic systems within Egypt, each capable of sustaining independent political authority, but neither possessing the resources necessary to reunify the kingdom by force. The gradual infiltration of Libyan populations into the Delta region during the late New Kingdom accelerated under the weakened central authority of the 21st dynasty. These were not violent invasions, but systematic settlement processes involving Libyan tribal groups who had served as mercenaries in Egyptian armies and gradually established permanent communities throughout Lower Egypt. The Meshwesh and Libu tribes, originally from the western desert regions, brought distinct cultural practices, military traditions, and political organizations that would fundamentally alter Egyptian society. Within a few generations, Libyans would not merely live in Egypt, they would rule it. Libyan military organization differed significantly from traditional Egyptian systems, emphasizing tribal loyalty and personal relationships between warriors and their chiefs rather than the bureaucratic hierarchies that had characterized pharaonic armies. Libyan warriors fought with distinctive weapons, including curved swords, small round shields, and composite bows, while their leaders wore elaborate feathered headdresses and ornamental clothing that distinguished them from Egyptian officials. These military traditions proved highly effective in the decentralized political environment of the Third Intermediate Period, where personal loyalty and military prowess often determined political success more than administrative competence or religious authority. The rise of Shashank I, around 945 BC, marked the beginning of Libyan political dominance in Egypt, though his accession represented the culmination of gradual processes rather than sudden conquest. Shashank belonged to a Libyan family that had served Egyptian pharaohs for several generations, accumulating wealth and political connections through military service and strategic marriages with Egyptian noble families. His uncle Osiris the Elder had briefly ruled as pharaoh during the late 21st dynasty, establishing precedents for Libyan participation in royal succession that Shashank would exploit more successfully. When Shashank took the throne, he did so not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate heir to pharaonic authority, accepted by both Egyptian and Libyan populations. The 22nd dynasty established by Shashank represented a synthesis of Libyan and Egyptian political traditions that created new forms of governance adapted to Egypt's changed circumstances. Shashank maintained traditional pharaonic titles and religious ceremonies while incorporating Libyan tribal structures into his administration. He appointed family members to key positions throughout Egypt, creating a network of related rulers who governed major cities and provinces as semi-autonomous vassals rather than appointed officials subject to central authority. This system resembled feudal arrangements more than traditional pharaonic administration, but it provided stability by eliminating conflicts between competing power centers. Shashank's military campaigns in Palestine around 925 BC demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Libyan-Egyptian power. His forces successfully captured numerous cities throughout the former Egyptian Empire, including Jerusalem, where they plundered Solomon's temple and extracted tribute from the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The campaign reliefs at Karnak depict over 150 conquered cities and towns, suggesting the scale of Egyptian military operations and the temporary restoration of imperial authority in the Levant. However, these conquests proved ephemeral, as Shashank lacked the administrative infrastructure necessary to maintain permanent control over distant territories. Egyptian forces withdrew after extracting tribute and plunder, leaving local rulers to resume their independence once the immediate military threat disappeared. The internal structure of Libyan-Egyptian governance reflected the decentralized nature of tribal political organization. Shashank appointed his sons and close relatives as rulers of major Egyptian cities, creating a system of family-based authority that initially provided stability by eliminating conflicts between competing power centers. Osiris, his elder son, received appointment as high priest of Amun at Thebes, while other family members governed Memphis, Heracleopolis, and provincial centers throughout Egypt. This system worked well as long as family relationships remained close and family members remained loyal to central authority. The systematic destruction of Egyptian independence under the Second Persian occupation had eliminated not merely political autonomy, but the fundamental cultural and administrative structures that had sustained pharaonic civilization for over 3 millennia. When Alexander III of Macedon approached Egypt's eastern frontier in 332 BC, he encountered a kingdom whose native institutions had been systematically dismantled, while Persian administrative control rested on military force rather than popular acceptance. The young Macedonian king's arrival represented not simply another change of foreign rulers, but the beginning of a transformation that would fundamentally alter Egypt's relationship with the broader Mediterranean world, while preserving essential elements of pharaonic tradition within new institutional frameworks. Alexander's military reputation preceded his arrival in Egypt. as news of his devastating victories at Granicus and Issus had spread throughout the Persian Empire, creating expectations of inevitable Macedonian triumph that undermined Persian defensive preparations. The Persian satrap Ramesses, commanding approximately 8,000 troops in Egypt, recognized the impossibility of effective resistance against the army that had destroyed the main Persian field forces and captured the imperial treasury at Damascus. His decision to surrender Egypt without significant military engagement reflected pragmatic assessment of strategic realities rather than cowardice or disloyalty, as continued resistance would have resulted only in the destruction of his forces without affecting the ultimate outcome of Macedonian conquest. The Egyptian population's response to Alexander's arrival demonstrated the profound alienation that Persian occupation policies had created between imperial administration and local populations. Egyptian priests and provincial officials welcomed the Macedonian conqueror as a liberator from Persian oppression, providing intelligence about Persian positions and administrative arrangements, while offering religious legitimization for Alexander's assumption of pharaonic authority. The contrast between this enthusiastic reception and the resistance that Persian forces had encountered during previous Egyptian rebellions revealed the complete collapse of Persian legitimacy among Egyptian populations who had experienced decades of harsh occupation policies and systematic cultural suppression. Alexander's coronation as pharaoh at Memphis involved elaborate ceremonies that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Egyptian religious traditions and their political significance. The Macedonian king participated in traditional rituals that established his divine status as the earthly representative of Egyptian deities, while receiving the double crown that symbolized authority over Upper and Lower Egypt. These ceremonies, conducted by Egyptian priests who had preserved essential religious knowledge despite Persian persecution, provided Alexander with legitimacy that transcended mere military conquest, while establishing precedents for the integration of Macedonian and Egyptian political traditions that would characterize subsequent Ptolemaic rule. The famous journey to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis represented Alexander's most dramatic engagement with Egyptian religious traditions, while creating mythological associations that would influence his subsequent career and posthumous reputation. The oracle's recognition of Alexander as the son of Ammon Zeus provided divine confirmation of his pharaonic status, while establishing connections between Egyptian and Greek religious traditions that facilitated cultural synthesis throughout the Hellenistic period. The journey itself, involving a dangerous crossing of the western desert with limited water supplies and uncertain navigation, demonstrated Alexander's personal courage while creating legendary narratives that enhanced his charismatic authority among both Macedonian and Egyptian followers. The foundation of Alexandria in 331 BC marked Alexander's most enduring contribution to Egyptian history, creating a city that would serve as the kingdom's capital for nearly a millennium, while becoming one of the ancient world's greatest centers of commerce, learning, and cultural exchange. The site selection demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Egyptian geography and commercial requirements, as the location provided excellent harbor facilities for Mediterranean shipping, while maintaining connection to the Nile Delta through canal systems that enabled access to Egypt's agricultural heartland. Alexander personally supervised the initial city planning, establishing the grid pattern of streets and the locations of major public buildings that would guide Alexandria's subsequent development. The administrative arrangements that Alexander established for Egyptian governance reflected both the practical necessities of maintaining control over distant territories during ongoing military campaigns and the political sensitivities involved in governing populations with distinct cultural traditions. The Macedonian king appointed separate officials for military command, financial administration, and civil governance, preventing the concentration of authority that might have enabled rebellion, while ensuring that specialized expertise addressed the diverse requirements of Egyptian administration. Egyptian officials retained positions in local government and religious institutions, maintaining continuity with traditional practices while acknowledging Macedonian supremacy. Alexander's departure from Egypt in 331 BC to continue his campaigns against the Persian heartland left the kingdom under the governance of officials whose primary loyalties remained with the Macedonian king rather than Egyptian institutions or populations. The subsequent decade of Alexander's conquests, extending Macedonian power from Egypt to India, created an empire of unprecedented scale, while generating administrative challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BC, at the age of 32, eliminated the personal authority that had held this vast empire together, while initiating succession conflicts that would determine the political geography of the Hellenistic world for the following 3 centuries. The Wars of the Diadochi, as the conflicts among Alexander's successors became known, involved complex military and diplomatic maneuvering among generals who had served under the Macedonian king and now sought to establish independent kingdoms from the fragments of his empire. Ptolemy, son of Lagos, who had served as one of Alexander's most trusted commanders, secured control over Egypt through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and strategic positioning that established the foundation for the longest-lasting of the Hellenistic successor kingdoms. His seizure of Alexander's body during its transport from Babylon to Macedonia provided powerful symbolic legitimacy while denying this valuable asset to rival claimants. Ptolemy's initial governance of Egypt as satrap, rather than independent king, reflected the political complexities of the succession period, as formal claims to royal authority might have provoked coordinated opposition from other Diadochi, who maintained nominal allegiance to Alexander's legitimate heirs. This cautious approach enabled Ptolemy to consolidate control over Egyptian territory and resources while avoiding the military confrontations that destroyed several of his rivals. The defensive advantages provided by Egypt's geographic position, with deserts protecting the western and eastern frontiers, while the Mediterranean limited northern approaches, enabled Ptolemy to resist invasion attempts while building the military and economic foundations for eventual independence. The formal establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty around 305 BC, when Ptolemy assumed the title of king following the final collapse of unified Macedonian authority, marked the beginning of a new phase in Egyptian history that would combine Greek political institutions with pharaonic traditions in unprecedented ways. Ptolemy I Soter, as he became known, established administrative systems that integrated Macedonian military organization with Egyptian bureaucratic traditions, creating governmental structures capable of extracting resources efficiently while maintaining stability throughout the kingdom's diverse territories. The dual nature of Ptolemaic authority, presenting the rulers as Greek kings to Macedonian and Greek populations, while maintaining pharaonic traditions for Egyptian subjects, enabled effective governance of culturally distinct communities within a unified political framework. The economic policies implemented under Ptolemy I established patterns of state intervention and resource extraction that would characterize Ptolemaic administration throughout the dynasty's 3-century existence. The royal monopolies on essential commodities, including oil, papyrus, and certain textile products, generated enormous revenues while enabling governmental control over economic activities that might otherwise have supported independent power centers. The systematic development of Egyptian agricultural production, particularly in the Fayum region, where extensive irrigation projects expanded cultivable land, increased the kingdom's productive capacity, while demonstrating the benefits of centralized planning and resource allocation. The cultural policies of the early Ptolemaic period reflected sophisticated understanding of the diverse populations under royal authority and the different institutional frameworks necessary for effective governance of Greek and Egyptian communities. The foundation of the Museum and Library at Alexandria created institutions for Greek intellectual activity that attracted scholars from throughout the Mediterranean world, while establishing Alexandria as the preeminent center of Hellenistic learning. Simultaneously, Ptolemaic support for Egyptian temple construction and religious ceremonies maintained traditional institutions that provided legitimacy among native populations, while preserving cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during periods of foreign domination. The military organization developed under the early Ptolemies combined Macedonian tactical innovations with Egyptian manpower resources, creating armed forces capable of defending the kingdom's extensive territories while projecting power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic army included Macedonian and Greek settlers who received land grants in exchange for military service, creating a class of military colonists whose interests aligned with royal authority while providing trained reserves for major campaigns. Egyptian soldiers served in supporting roles initially, though their participation in combat formations increased over time as the availability of Greek and Macedonian settlers declined. The naval capabilities developed under Ptolemaic rule established Egyptian dominance over the eastern Mediterranean that would persist for over a century, enabling control over strategic islands and coastal territories, while protecting commercial shipping that generated substantial revenues for the royal treasury. The Ptolemaic fleet included the largest warships constructed in the ancient world, with vessels carrying hundreds of rowers and equipped with multiple banks of oars that provided superior speed and maneuverability compared to smaller enemy craft. These naval forces enabled Ptolemaic intervention in Greek affairs while protecting Egyptian commercial interests throughout the Mediterranean trading network. The reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, extending from 285 to 246 BC, represented the zenith of Ptolemaic power and cultural achievement, as the kingdom's military strength, economic prosperity, and intellectual prestige reached levels that would not be equal during subsequent generations. The second Ptolemy inherited a stable kingdom with established administrative systems and substantial financial reserves, enabling ambitious programs of territorial expansion, cultural patronage, and monumental construction that demonstrated Egyptian power throughout the Mediterranean world. His reign established patterns of royal behavior and institutional development that would characterize the Ptolemaic dynasty throughout its subsequent history. The territorial expansion achieved under Ptolemy II extended Egyptian influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean, establishing control over strategic positions that protected commercial interests while providing defensive depth against potential enemies. Ptolemaic forces occupied Cyprus, whose copper resources and strategic location made it essential for naval operations, while garrisons in Cyrenaica secured the kingdom's western frontier against potential threats from Carthage or other North African powers. The acquisition of territories along the Levantine coast, including important commercial centers at Tyre and Sidon, provided access to traditional trade routes while generating customs revenues that substantially increased royal income. The Syrian wars that dominated Ptolemaic foreign policy throughout the 3rd century BC involved repeated conflicts with the Seleucid Empire for control over the strategically vital territories connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. These campaigns, which continued intermittently for over a century, consumed enormous military and financial resources, while producing territorial changes that reflected the relative strength of the competing powers at particular moments, rather than permanent strategic advantages. The First Syrian War, conducted during Ptolemy II's reign, achieved significant territorial gains that extended Egyptian control throughout southern Syria and Palestine, while demonstrating the effectiveness of Ptolemaic military organization against Seleucid forces. The economic prosperity achieved under Ptolemy II reflected both the kingdom's natural advantages and the effectiveness of administrative systems that maximized resource extraction while maintaining productive capacity. Egyptian agricultural output, enhanced by irrigation projects and improved cultivation techniques, generated surpluses that supported urban populations and export trade, while providing revenues for royal expenditures. The systematic exploitation of gold mines in Nubia and the Eastern Desert produced precious metals that funded military operations and diplomatic initiatives, while enabling the accumulation of treasury reserves that provided security against future emergencies. The cultural patronage extended by Ptolemy II established Alexandria as the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, attracting scholars, poets, and scientists whose work would influence Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The Library of Alexandria, which the second Ptolemy expanded substantially, accumulated the largest collection of texts in the ancient world through systematic acquisition programs that included the copying of manuscripts from ships visiting Alexandria's harbor. The museum, functioning as a research institution that provided scholars with financial support and access to library resources, enabled sustained intellectual work that produced fundamental advances in mathematics, astronomy, geography, and literary criticism. The scientific achievements associated with Ptolemaic Alexandria included Euclid's systematization of geometry, Eratosthenes' calculation of the Earth's circumference, and Aristarchus' heliocentric model of the solar system, demonstrating the intellectual productivity enabled by royal patronage and institutional support. These scholars worked within an environment that encouraged systematic investigation and the accumulation of knowledge, creating methodological approaches that would influence scientific practice throughout subsequent centuries. The translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek, known as the Septuagint, represented another significant cultural achievement of Ptolemy II's reign, making Jewish religious texts accessible to Greek-speaking populations while facilitating cultural exchange between distinct religious traditions. The construction projects undertaken during Ptolemy II's reign demonstrated both the kingdom's economic resources and the integration of Greek and Egyptian architectural traditions that characterized Ptolemaic cultural policy. The Pharaohs lighthouse, constructed on an island in Alexandria's harbor, rose over 100 meters in height and utilized mirrors to project light visible from distances exceeding 50 kilometers, providing navigation assistance for ships approaching the city, while serving as a symbol of Ptolemaic technological achievement. The lighthouse's construction required advanced engineering techniques and enormous quantities of materials, demonstrating the organizational capabilities that enabled Ptolemaic administration to complete ambitious projects. The religious policies of Ptolemy II continued the dual approach established by his father, maintaining Greek religious institutions for Macedonian and Greek populations while supporting Egyptian temple construction and ceremonial activities that provided legitimacy among native subjects. The introduction of the Serapis cult, which combined elements of Greek and Egyptian religious traditions, represented an attempt to create shared religious practices that might bridge cultural divisions within the kingdom's diverse population. However, the cult's appeal remained largely limited to Greek and Hellenized populations, as traditional Egyptian religious practices retained their hold on native communities throughout the Ptolemaic period. The administrative refinements implemented under Ptolemy II enhanced governmental efficiency, while increasing royal control over economic activities throughout the kingdom. The detailed regulations preserved in papyrus documents from this period reveal the comprehensive nature of Ptolemaic administration, which specified procedures for tax collection, agricultural management, and commercial activities with remarkable precision. The bureaucratic apparatus necessary to implement these regulations employed thousands of officials whose activities generated the documentary records that provide modern historians with unprecedented insight into ancient economic and social conditions. The succession arrangements established by Ptolemy II, including the practice of sibling marriage that would characterize subsequent Ptolemaic rulers, reflected both Egyptian pharaonic traditions and practical political considerations that sought to concentrate royal authority within the immediate family, while preventing succession disputes that might destabilize the kingdom. The marriage of Ptolemy II to his sister Arsinoe II, though shocking to Greek sensibilities, followed Egyptian precedents while creating a powerful partnership that enhanced royal authority through the combination of male and female divine associations. The reign of Ptolemy III Euergetes, extending from 246 to 222 BC, witnessed the greatest territorial expansion in Ptolemaic history, as Egyptian forces achieved temporary control over vast territories extending from Cyrenaica to the borders of India. The Third Syrian War, provoked by succession disputes within the Seleucid dynasty, enabled Ptolemaic armies to advance deep into Mesopotamia, while capturing the Seleucid capital at Antioch and recovering sacred objects that Persian conquerors had removed from Egyptian temples centuries earlier. These campaigns demonstrated the military capabilities that Ptolemaic organization had developed, while generating enormous quantities of plunder that enriched the royal treasury. The territorial gains achieved during the Third Syrian War proved impossible to maintain permanently, as the logistical challenges of governing distant territories exceeded Ptolemaic administrative capabilities, while Seleucid recovery eventually enabled the recapture of lost provinces. However, the campaigns established Ptolemaic prestige throughout the Hellenistic world, while demonstrating that Egyptian military power could challenge the largest of the successor kingdoms on equal terms. The triumphal return of Ptolemy III to Alexandria, celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that emphasized the recovery of Egyptian religious treasures, enhanced royal legitimacy while providing propaganda materials that subsequent generations would utilize to maintain dynastic prestige. The cultural achievements of Ptolemy III's reign included significant additions to the Library of Alexandria and continued support for scientific research that produced fundamental advances in various fields. The Canopus Decree, issued in 238 BC, established calendar reforms that anticipated the Julian calendar by over 2 centuries, while demonstrating the sophisticated astronomical knowledge available to Ptolemaic scholars. The decree's provisions for adding an extra day every 4 years to maintain alignment between the civil calendar and astronomical observations reflected understanding of the solar year's actual length that exceeded the precision of earlier Egyptian calendar systems. The economic policies of Ptolemy III maintained the prosperity established under his predecessors while adapting to changed circumstances created by territorial expansion and military expenditures. The integration of newly conquered territories into Ptolemaic administrative systems required substantial investment in infrastructure and personnel, while generating revenues that partially offset these costs. The development of Red Sea trade routes, connecting Egypt with Arabian and Indian markets, opened new commercial opportunities that would become increasingly important during subsequent centuries as Mediterranean trade patterns evolved. The reign of Ptolemy IV Philopator, extending from 222 to 204 BC, marked the beginning of Ptolemaic decline, as military setbacks, administrative deterioration, and dynastic conflicts undermined the foundations of royal authority that previous generations had established. The fourth Ptolemy inherited a kingdom that retained substantial military and economic resources, but faced mounting challenges from resurgent Seleucid power under Antiochus III, while internal tensions between Greek and Egyptian populations created instabilities that would intensify throughout subsequent generations. The king's personal characteristics, including reported indolence and excessive devotion to religious cults, contributed to governmental dysfunction, while enabling court favorites to accumulate influence that properly belonged to royal authority. The Fourth Syrian War, which began shortly after Ptolemy IV's accession, initially threatened catastrophic defeat as Seleucid forces under Antiochus III achieved significant victories that eliminated Ptolemaic control over territories in Syria and Palestine that had been held for generations. The Seleucid advance toward Egypt's eastern frontier created existential threats that required unprecedented military mobilization, including the recruitment of native Egyptian soldiers into combat formations that had previously been reserved for Greek and Macedonian personnel. This military necessity, driven by the shortage of Greek settlers available for military service, would have profound consequences for Egyptian society and Ptolemaic political stability. The Battle of Raphia in 217 BC represented the decisive confrontation of the Fourth Syrian War, resulting in a Ptolemaic victory that preserved Egyptian territorial integrity while demonstrating the military effectiveness of native Egyptian troops fighting in Greek-style phalanx formations. The battle involved approximately 70,000 troops on each side, making it one of the largest military engagements of the Hellenistic period, while its outcome reflected the superior training and motivation of Ptolemaic forces, rather than significant advantages in numbers or equipment. The Egyptian contingents, numbering approximately 20,000 soldiers, performed effectively against Seleucid formations, contributing substantially to the victory, while demonstrating that native Egyptians could master Greek military techniques. The political consequences of Raphia extended far beyond immediate military outcomes, as the demonstrated military capability of native Egyptian soldiers undermined the social hierarchy that had maintained Greek dominance over Egyptian populations since Alexander's conquest. Egyptian soldiers who had proven their worth in battle against the kingdom's most dangerous enemy developed expectations of improved status and treatment that existing social arrangements could not accommodate. The resulting tensions contributed to rebellions that would destabilize Upper Egypt for over 2 decades, while permanently altering relationships between Greek and Egyptian communities throughout the kingdom. The Great Revolt that began around 206 BC in Upper Egypt represented the most serious internal challenge to Ptolemaic authority since the dynasty's establishment, as native Egyptian leaders proclaimed independent pharaonic rule while establishing administrative systems that rejected Greek dominance. The rebellion's leaders, Har-Wennefer and his successor, Ankh-Wennefer, claimed traditional pharaonic titles while conducting religious ceremonies that emphasized Egyptian cultural identity and rejection of foreign rule. Their control over Thebes and surrounding territories persisted for over 20 years, demonstrating the depth of Egyptian resentment toward Ptolemaic administration, while revealing the limitations of royal military power when confronted with determined local resistance. The administrative deterioration that characterized Ptolemy IV's reign reflected both the king's personal deficiencies and structural problems within Ptolemaic governmental systems that had accumulated over generations. Court favorites accumulated influence that enabled corruption and inefficiency, while royal attention focused on religious activities and personal pleasures rather than governmental responsibilities. The murder of the king's mother, wife, and brother, allegedly ordered by court officials seeking to eliminate potential rivals, demonstrated the dysfunction that had developed within the royal household, while creating precedents for violence that would characterize subsequent succession disputes. The death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BC initiated a succession crisis that revealed the full extent of Ptolemaic institutional decay, as the young Ptolemy, the fifth Epiphanes, inherited the throne as a child, while court factions competed for control over royal authority. The regency government that administered the kingdom during the young king's minority proved incapable of addressing the multiple challenges facing Ptolemaic rule, including the ongoing rebellion in Upper Egypt, renewed Seleucid pressure on Syrian territories, and internal conflicts among Greek and Egyptian populations. The resulting instability enabled foreign powers to exploit Ptolemaic weakness while domestic conditions deteriorated throughout the kingdom. The Fifth Syrian War, which began around 202 BC, resulted in catastrophic territorial losses as Seleucid forces under Antiochus III conquered the Ptolemaic possessions in Syria and Palestine that had been held since the dynasty's establishment. The Battle of Panium in 200 BC eliminated Ptolemaic military presence in the region, while establishing Seleucid control over territories that would remain outside Egyptian authority for the remainder of the Ptolemaic period. These losses reduced Ptolemaic revenues substantially, while eliminating strategic positions that had provided defensive depth against potential invasions of Egypt itself. The Rosetta Stone, issued in 196 BC, to commemorate Ptolemy V's coronation and the suppression of the Upper Egyptian rebellion, provides invaluable evidence for understanding Ptolemaic administrative practices and the relationship between Greek and Egyptian cultural traditions during this period of crisis. The decree's trilingual format, presenting identical texts in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek scripts, reflected the multicultural nature of Ptolemaic society, while enabling the modern decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics that had been lost for over a millennium. The decree's content, emphasizing royal benefactions to Egyptian temples and the restoration of traditional religious practices, demonstrated continued Ptolemaic efforts to maintain legitimacy among native populations, despite the evident decline of royal authority. The suppression of the Upper Egyptian rebellion around 186 BC required sustained military operations that consumed substantial resources, while demonstrating the continued capability of Ptolemaic forces when properly organized and commanded. The campaign's success restored nominal royal authority throughout Egyptian territory, while eliminating the alternative pharaonic government that had challenged Ptolemaic legitimacy for over 2 decades. However, the underlying tensions between Greek and Egyptian populations remained unresolved, creating conditions for future conflicts that would continue to destabilize the kingdom throughout subsequent generations. The reign of Ptolemy VI Philometor, extending from 180 to 145 BC with interruptions, witnessed continued decline in Ptolemaic power and prestige as external pressures combined with internal conflicts to undermine royal authority. The Sixth Syrian War, provoked by Seleucid aggression under Antiochus IV, resulted in the temporary occupation of Egypt itself as Seleucid forces advanced to the outskirts of Alexandria before Roman diplomatic intervention forced their withdrawal. This humiliating episode demonstrated Ptolemaic military weakness, while establishing Roman influence over Egyptian affairs that would gradually increase throughout subsequent decades. The dynastic conflicts between Ptolemy VI and his brother Ptolemy VIII, Euergetes II, created prolonged instability that divided the kingdom and consumed resources in civil warfare rather than productive activities. The brothers' competing claims to royal authority, supported by different factions within the Greek and Egyptian populations, produced alternating periods of joint rule, separate kingdoms, and open warfare that devastated Egyptian prosperity, while enabling foreign powers to exploit Ptolemaic divisions. The eventual resolution of these conflicts through Ptolemy VIII's sole rule following his brother's death in 145 BC brought temporary stability, but could not reverse the fundamental decline that had characterized the preceding decades. The reign of Ptolemy VIII, Euergetes II, extending from 145 to 116 BC, with earlier periods of joint rule, represented an attempt to restore Ptolemaic authority through policies that favored native Egyptian populations while reducing the privileges of Greek settlers who had dominated the kingdom since its establishment. The king's marriage to his brother's widow Cleopatra II, followed by his subsequent marriage to her daughter Cleopatra III, created complex dynastic arrangements that generated prolonged conflicts within the royal family, while providing opportunities for various factions to advance their interests through support for competing claimants. These internal divisions consumed royal attention and resources, while external pressures continued to erode Ptolemaic territorial possessions and international prestige. The administrative reforms implemented under Ptolemy VIII included measures that improved the status of native Egyptians within governmental hierarchies, while reducing the exclusive privileges that Greek settlers had enjoyed since the dynasty's establishment. Egyptian priests received increased support for temple construction and religious activities, while native Egyptians gained access to administrative positions that had previously been reserved for Greek personnel. These policies reflected both genuine concern for Egyptian welfare and practical recognition that Greek settler populations had declined to levels insufficient for maintaining traditional administrative arrangements. The cultural policies of Ptolemy VIII demonstrated continued commitment to intellectual activities that had characterized earlier Ptolemaic rule, though the king's conflicts with Alexandrian scholars created disruptions that temporarily reduced the city's intellectual productivity. The expulsion of scholars from Alexandria during periods of political conflict scattered intellectual talent throughout the Mediterranean world, while establishing centers of learning in other cities that would eventually challenge Alexandria's preeminence. However, the library and museum continued to function throughout these disruptions, preserving their essential character as institutions for research and the accumulation of knowledge. The succession conflicts that followed Ptolemy VIII's death in 116 BC initiated a period of prolonged instability that would characterize the final century of Ptolemaic rule, as competing claimants, supported by different factions within the royal family and broader population, struggled for control over diminishing royal authority. Cleopatra III's conflicts with her sons Ptolemy IX and Ptolemy X produced alternating periods of rule that destabilized governmental administration while consuming resources in civil warfare. The involvement of foreign powers, particularly Rome, in these succession disputes established precedents for external intervention that would eventually culminate in the elimination of Ptolemaic independence. Roman influence over Egyptian affairs increased steadily throughout the 1st century BC as the expanding republic sought to secure access to Egyptian grain supplies while preventing the kingdom's resources from falling under the control of potential rivals. Roman diplomatic interventions in Ptolemaic succession disputes established patterns of dependence that reduced Egyptian rulers to clients whose authority depended on Roman support rather than independent military or economic power. The bequest of Cyrenaica to Rome by Ptolemy Apion in 96 BC demonstrated the extent to which Ptolemaic territories had become subject to Roman disposition, while establishing precedents for the eventual incorporation of Egypt itself into Roman dominion. The reign of Ptolemy XII Auletes, extending from 80 to 51 BC with interruptions, exemplified the dependent status that characterized late Ptolemaic rulers, as the king's authority rested primarily on Roman support rather than domestic legitimacy or military capability. Ptolemy XII's payment of enormous bribes to Roman politicians to secure recognition of his rule and support against domestic opponents consumed treasury reserves while creating debts that would burden subsequent generations. The king's expulsion from Egypt by Alexandrian populations, outraged by his subservience to Rome, followed by his restoration through Roman military intervention, demonstrated the complete dependence of Ptolemaic authority on external support. The Roman military expedition that restored Ptolemy XII to power in 55 BC established direct Roman military presence in Egypt, while creating relationships between Roman commanders and Egyptian court factions that would influence subsequent political developments. Gabinius, the Roman general who commanded the restoration expedition, left a garrison of Roman soldiers in Alexandria, whose presence provided security for the restored king, while establishing precedents for Roman military involvement in Egyptian affairs. The young cavalry officer Marcus Antonius, who participated in this expedition, developed connections with the Egyptian court that would prove significant during subsequent decades. The death of Ptolemy XII in 51 BC left the kingdom to his children Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIII, whose joint rule according to their father's will quickly deteriorated into conflict as court factions supporting each sibling competed for dominance. Cleopatra VII, who would become the most famous of all Ptolemaic rulers, demonstrated from the beginning of her reign the intelligence, ambition, and political skill that would enable her to maintain Egyptian independence for over 2 decades despite overwhelming Roman power. Her initial expulsion from Alexandria by supporters of her brother Ptolemy XIII set the stage for the dramatic events that would follow Julius Caesar's arrival in Egypt. The Alexandrian War of 48 to 47 BC, which began when Julius Caesar intervened in the Ptolemaic succession dispute following his pursuit of Pompey to Egypt, demonstrated both the continued military capabilities of Alexandrian populations and the ultimate superiority of Roman military organization when properly commanded. Caesar's forces, initially numbering only a few thousand soldiers, faced determined resistance from Alexandrian troops and populations who resented Roman interference in Egyptian affairs. The prolonged siege and street fighting that followed consumed several months and resulted in significant Roman casualties, while the famous burning of ships in Alexandria's harbor allegedly destroyed portions of the library's collections. Caesar's victory in the Alexandrian War and his subsequent support for Cleopatra VII's rule established the queen as the dominant figure in Egyptian politics, while creating the personal relationship between Roman commander and Egyptian queen that would produce a son, Caesarion, whose existence complicated subsequent succession arrangements. Caesar's departure from Egypt left Cleopatra in control of the kingdom with Roman military support, while the elimination of her brother Ptolemy XIII during the war removed the primary domestic challenger to her authority. The queen's subsequent visit to Rome, where she resided in Caesar's villa until his assassination in 44 BC, demonstrated the close relationship between Egyptian and Roman leadership while generating controversy among Roman populations who resented the foreign queen's influence. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC transformed the political landscape throughout the Roman world, while creating both dangers and opportunities for Cleopatra VII's continued rule in Egypt. The queen's return to Alexandria following Caesar's death enabled her to consolidate control over Egyptian administration, while the subsequent Roman civil wars between Caesar's assassins and his political heirs created possibilities for Egyptian influence that a more powerful Rome might not have permitted. Cleopatra's elimination of her remaining brother Ptolemy XIV, allegedly through poisoning, and her elevation of her son Caesarion as co-ruler, demonstrated her determination to maintain dynastic control while establishing connections to Caesar's legacy that might prove valuable in dealings with his successors. The emergence of the Second Triumvirate, comprising Octavian, Marcus Antonius, and Lepidus, created a new configuration of Roman power that would determine Egypt's fate during the following decades. The division of Roman territories that assigned the eastern provinces to Marcus Antonius brought Egyptian affairs under the authority of a Roman leader whose previous connections with the Egyptian court and personal characteristics made him potentially susceptible to Cleopatra's influence. The queen's famous meeting with Antonius at Tarsus in 41 BC, where she arrived on a gilded barge with purple sails and silver oars while dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, demonstrated her understanding of theatrical display and its political utility, while initiating the relationship that would dominate both their subsequent careers. The alliance between Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius combined Egyptian resources with Roman military power in arrangements that served both partners' interests, while creating the most serious challenge to Octavian's eventual dominance over the Roman world. Antonius received financial support for his military campaigns against Parthia and other eastern enemies, while Cleopatra gained Roman military backing for her rule and the expansion of Egyptian territorial control. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BC, which assigned Roman and Ptolemaic territories to Cleopatra's children by both Caesar and Antonius, represented the most dramatic expression of their partnership, while providing Octavian with propaganda materials that he would exploit effectively in subsequent conflicts. The military campaigns that Antonius conducted with Egyptian support achieved mixed results that reflected both the capabilities and limitations of the forces at his disposal. The Parthian expedition of 36 BC, intended to avenge earlier Roman defeats and extend Roman power into Mesopotamia, ended in costly failure, as Antonius's forces suffered severe casualties during their retreat through Armenian territory. However, subsequent campaigns achieved more positive outcomes, including the conquest of Armenia and the establishment of Roman influence over territories that had previously resisted Mediterranean power. These military activities consumed enormous resources while demonstrating the potential of Roman-Egyptian cooperation when properly organized and commanded. Cleopatra's domestic policies during this period reflected her understanding of Egyptian traditions and her determination to present herself as a legitimate pharaoh rather than merely a Greek ruler of Egyptian territories. The queen's adoption of traditional pharaonic titles and her participation in Egyptian religious ceremonies demonstrated respect for native traditions that earlier Ptolemaic rulers had sometimes neglected. Her identification with the goddess Isis, whose cult had spread throughout the Mediterranean world, provided religious legitimacy that transcended cultural boundaries while establishing connections between Egyptian and Greek religious traditions that facilitated her rule over diverse populations. The propaganda war between Octavian and Antonius that preceded their military confrontation utilized Egyptian themes extensively, as Octavian portrayed his rival as a Roman leader corrupted by foreign influences, who had abandoned Roman traditions for Oriental luxury and despotism. The characterization of Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress who had ensnared Roman leaders through feminine wiles reflected Roman anxieties about foreign influence, while providing justification for military action against a fellow Roman citizen. Octavian's declaration of war against Cleopatra rather than Antonius directly enabled him to present the conflict as a defense of Roman interests against foreign aggression, rather than another episode in Roman civil warfare. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC represented the decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of both the Roman world and Egyptian independence, as the combined forces of Antonius and Cleopatra faced Octavian's fleet in the waters off the western coast of Greece. The engagement involved approximately 500 warships and over 100,000 soldiers and sailors, making it one of the largest naval battles in ancient history. The tactical details of the battle remain disputed, but its outcome proved decisive, as Antonius and Cleopatra's forces suffered catastrophic defeat that eliminated their naval power, while their land forces subsequently surrendered or defected to Octavian. The flight of Antonius and Cleopatra from Actium to Egypt initiated the final phase of their partnership, as both leaders recognized that Octavian's victory had made their ultimate defeat inevitable, while seeking to negotiate arrangements that might preserve some portion of their positions or protect their children's futures. Cleopatra's reported negotiations with Octavian, offering to abdicate in favor of her children, or to eliminate Antonius in exchange for continued rule, demonstrated her pragmatic approach to political survival, while revealing the desperate circumstances that Actium had created. However, Octavian's determination to eliminate all potential rivals and secure complete control over Egyptian resources made meaningful compromise impossible. The final siege of Alexandria in 30 BC brought Roman forces to the gates of the Ptolemaic capital, while Antonius and Cleopatra made their final preparations for the end of their rule and their lives. Antonius's suicide, reportedly prompted by false reports of Cleopatra's death, eliminated the Roman partner whose military reputation had provided the alliance's primary military asset. Cleopatra's subsequent death, traditionally attributed to the bite of an asp, though the actual circumstances remain uncertain, ended the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, while eliminating the last independent ruler of the ancient Egyptian kingdom. The death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BC marked not merely the end of Ptolemaic rule, but the conclusion of over 3 millennia of pharaonic civilization that had created one of humanity's most remarkable and enduring cultural achievements. The kingdom that had built the pyramids, developed hieroglyphic writing, and maintained continuous governmental institutions longer than any other civilization in human history, now became a province of the Roman Empire, its resources and populations subject to foreign administration that would persist for the following 7 centuries. The transformation of Egypt from independent kingdom to Roman province represented one of history's most significant political transitions, while preserving essential elements of Egyptian culture that would influence subsequent civilizations throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Roman annexation of Egypt, following Cleopatra's death, established administrative arrangements that reflected the kingdom's unique importance within the expanding empire, while preserving essential elements of pharaonic governmental traditions. Augustus, as Octavian became known following his assumption of supreme power, recognized Egypt's strategic and economic significance by establishing direct imperial control that excluded senatorial involvement in Egyptian affairs. The province's grain production, which supplied a substantial portion of Rome's food requirements, made Egyptian stability essential for imperial security, while the kingdom's accumulated wealth provided resources that funded Augustus's subsequent political and military initiatives. The administrative system implemented under Roman rule combined elements of Ptolemaic bureaucratic traditions with Roman provincial governance, creating hybrid arrangements that maintained governmental efficiency while ensuring loyalty to imperial authority. The prefect of Egypt, appointed directly by the emperor and responsible only to him, exercised authority that combined military command with civil administration in ways that distinguished Egyptian governance from other Roman provinces. The preservation of traditional Egyptian administrative divisions and the continued employment of Egyptian officials in local government maintained continuity with pharaonic traditions while integrating the kingdom into Roman imperial systems. The economic exploitation of Egypt under Roman rule intensified the resource extraction that had characterized Ptolemaic administration, while directing Egyptian wealth toward Roman rather than local purposes. The grain tribute that Egypt provided to Rome, estimated at approximately 1/3 of the city's annual consumption, represented an enormous transfer of agricultural production that sustained Roman urban populations while reducing resources available for Egyptian development. The systematic taxation of Egyptian agricultural production, craft industries, and commercial activities generated revenues that funded Roman military operations and administrative expenses throughout the empire, while contributing to the gradual impoverishment of Egyptian populations. The cultural policies of Roman administration demonstrated varying attitudes toward Egyptian traditions that reflected both practical administrative requirements and ideological preferences of individual emperors. Augustus and his immediate successors generally maintained support for Egyptian temple construction and religious ceremonies, recognizing the importance of traditional institutions for maintaining social stability and governmental legitimacy. The completion of temple complexes at Dendera, Edfu, and Philae during the Roman period demonstrated continued investment in Egyptian religious architecture, while the preservation of hieroglyphic writing and priestly education maintained cultural traditions that had survived previous periods of foreign domination. The spread of Egyptian religious practices throughout the Roman Empire represented one of the most significant cultural developments of the imperial period, as cults of Isis, Serapis, and other Egyptian deities attracted followers throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The appeal of Egyptian mystery religions, which offered initiates personal relationships with divine powers and promises of afterlife salvation, resonated with populations seeking spiritual fulfillment that traditional Greco-Roman religions did not provide. The establishment of Isis temples in Rome, Athens, and other major cities demonstrated the penetration of Egyptian religious influence into the heart of classical civilization, while creating networks of devotees who maintained connections with Egyptian sacred sites. The intellectual legacy of Ptolemaic Alexandria continued to influence Mediterranean civilization throughout the Roman period and beyond, as the scientific, literary, and philosophical achievements of Hellenistic scholars provided foundations for subsequent intellectual development. The Library of Alexandria, though diminished from its earlier greatness, remained an important center of learning that attracted scholars from throughout the empire while preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge accumulated by Alexandrian scholars influenced Roman engineering and calendar reform, while providing foundations for medieval and Renaissance scientific development. The gradual Christianization of Egypt during the Roman period transformed religious practices while preserving essential elements of pharaonic spiritual traditions within new institutional frameworks. The appeal of Christianity to Egyptian populations reflected both the religion's universal message and its resonance with traditional Egyptian beliefs about death, resurrection, and divine judgment. The development of Coptic Christianity, which utilized the Egyptian language written in Greek-derived script, maintained linguistic continuity with pharaonic traditions while creating new forms of religious expression that would characterize Egyptian spirituality for subsequent millennia. The monastic movement that emerged in Egypt during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD represented one of Christianity's most significant institutional innovations, establishing patterns of religious community life that would influence Christian practice throughout the world. The Desert Fathers, who withdrew from urban society to pursue spiritual perfection in the Egyptian wilderness, created models of ascetic practice that attracted followers from throughout the Christian world, while establishing monasteries that preserved learning and maintained religious traditions during subsequent periods of political instability. The Coptic monasteries that survive to the present day maintain direct continuity with these early Christian communities, while preserving manuscripts and artistic traditions that connect contemporary practice with ancient Egyptian heritage. The Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 AD marked another fundamental transformation in Egyptian history, as Islamic civilization replaced Byzantine Christian administration while introducing new religious, linguistic, and cultural traditions that would characterize Egyptian society for the following 14 centuries. However, the continuities that persisted through this transition demonstrated the resilience of Egyptian cultural traditions and their capacity to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential characteristics. The agricultural systems, administrative practices, and social structures that had developed over millennia continued to function under Islamic rule while gradually adapting to new requirements and influences. The modern rediscovery of ancient Egypt, initiated by Napoleon's expedition in 1798 and accelerated by Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822, revealed the full extent of pharaonic achievement to contemporary audiences, while establishing Egyptology as a scholarly discipline that continues to expand our understanding of ancient civilization. The systematic excavation of archaeological sites, the translation of ancient texts, and the preservation of monuments have recovered knowledge that had been lost for millennia, while demonstrating the sophistication and creativity of ancient Egyptian culture. The global fascination with ancient Egypt that these discoveries generated reflects the enduring appeal of a civilization that achieved remarkable accomplishments in architecture, art, literature, science, and governance. The legacy of ancient Egypt extends far beyond the monuments and artifacts that attract millions of visitors annually to encompass fundamental contributions to human civilization that continue to influence contemporary life. The development of writing systems, mathematical concepts, architectural techniques, and administrative practices in ancient Egypt provided foundations for subsequent civilizations, while demonstrating human capacity for cultural achievement under favorable conditions. The religious and philosophical concepts developed in ancient Egypt, including beliefs about divine kingship, cosmic order, and afterlife judgment, influenced Greek, Roman, Jewish, and Christian traditions, while contributing to the spiritual heritage of contemporary civilization. The 3 millennia of pharaonic civilization that this narrative has traced represent one of humanity's most remarkable achievements, demonstrating the capacity of organized societies to maintain cultural continuity and institutional stability across vast spans of time, while adapting to changing circumstances and overcoming repeated challenges. The pyramids that still dominate the Giza Plateau, the temples that line the Nile Valley, and the texts that preserve ancient Egyptian thought testify to the creativity and determination of the people who built one of history's greatest civilizations. Their legacy continues to inspire and instruct contemporary humanity, while reminding us of the possibilities that organized human effort can achieve when directed toward enduring purposes. The story of ancient Egypt, from the unification of the two lands under the first pharaohs to the death of Cleopatra and the Roman annexation, encompasses transformations and continuities that illuminate fundamental aspects of human social organization and cultural development. The civilization that emerged along the Nile Valley over 5,000 years ago created institutions, beliefs, and artistic traditions that influence subsequent civilizations throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, while establishing standards of achievement that continue to command admiration. The eternal Egypt that ancient Egyptians sought to create through their monuments and texts has achieved a form of immortality through the continued fascination that their civilization exercises over contemporary humanity, ensuring that the achievements of the pharaohs will continue to be remembered and studied for generations to come.